My name is David Smart. I am a Canadian editor and writer. I've come to Kendall because my book, Paul Preuss, Lord of the Abyss, is shortlisted for the Boardman Tasker 2019. The book is about Paul Preuss, Austrian free soloist who died in 1913. I chose to write it because he's always been something I knew a little bit about. In Canada, we have big connections to the Austrian and German climbing community and to the British climbing community because they brought climbing, technical climbing, to Canada. And when I started climbing in 1975, they'd learned to get along a bit, and these stories were just passed on to us. And Preuss was always this sort of shadowy figure. Well, we were using protection, but Paul Preuss, there was a guy who'd never used any. And I was just compelled by that, and eventually I read some of his original essays that he'd written, and I was just compelled to find out more about him and to be able to, the more I learned, the more I wanted to bring his story to an English-speaking audience. He achieved really quite a lot. I mean, he was a groundbreaking figure in rock climbing. In 5 days in 1911, he on-site free soloed and added a hard variation to the hardest rock climb in the Alps, the west face of the Totenkirchel. 5 days later, he on-site free soloed the first ascent of the east face of the CAMPANILE BASSO, which was a climb that everyone said just looked totally impossible. Then he down climbed it. So it's a little bit like somebody on-site free soloing the hardest, like just in pure comparison to contemporary standards, someone on-site free soloing the hardest route on El Capitan, and a few days later on-site free soloing the first ascent of an even harder route. It's like almost incomprehensible the degree to which it was a breakthrough in standards. No one had free soloed in the way that he free soloed. He free soloed new routes that people had said were impossible. Then he down climbed them because he believed that abseiling was cheating. He was also reacting against the introduction of pitons on a grand scale in the Alps, which came after the introduction of the carabiner. Because before the introduction of the carabiner, it was really hard to use a piton. It was either a picture hook, you looped the rope over and you hope it hung up there when you fell, or it was a ring piton. You had to carry in your pocket a piece of rope, put the piece of rope through the ring and around the lead rope, and tie an overhand knot in it to trap your lead rope. So as you can imagine, neither of those methods were good for very serious falls. As soon as the carabiner was introduced in about 1908, pitons proliferated because suddenly there was an easy, fast, safe way to use them. So he was seeing all these pitons introduced, and he just felt like we were going to lose something in climbing by relying too much on these things. He also said that he wanted a division between rock climbing and mountaineering. In mountaineering or alpinism, the objective was to get to the summit. In rock climbing, the objective was to climb a certain feature, whether it was a cliff or a ridge, and the summit was immaterial. But he said the rules of both sports are exactly the same, which are that you cannot climb up what you cannot climb down, and you can take rope and pitons and use them in an emergency, but as soon as you do, the climb has no value. He loved going to what was called the Klettergarten, like small climbing areas. He loved practicing climbing, he loved training, and he really enjoyed climbing on buildings. They would often have a few drinks before they went and did it, and it wasn't just on the lower parts of buildings, it was often very high up, and the police would sometimes come, and it was really a kind of fun, adventurous, adventurous event. He himself was Jewish, and he came from one of the most anti-Semitic places in Europe, which was Vienna. And the Great War came less than several months after he died. Many of the people he was involved with, like Hans Dulfer, died in the war. After the war, there was a tendency on the part of some people to blame Jews for the loss of the war, and as a result, he was deliberately excluded from the record, like beginning almost as soon as he died. People left him out of history books of Austrian climbing, where he, even though he was the greatest Austrian climber that that there was. The Nazis certainly further suppressed his record. They took the family home and assets. The family had to flee. And it wasn't really until after the Second World War where there was this revival of interest in style in climbing. There was interest in it in between the wars, but you know, with the free climbing concerns and characters like Walter Bonatti, they revived interest in him, and Messner as well. But he didn't have any direct followers, right? He didn't have anyone who said, I'm going to do what Paul Preuss did. Towards the end of his life, he realized that that was not really going to happen too. That I think his big contribution, Paul Preuss's big contribution to the development of rock climbing style was when these technical aids were being introduced. He said, rock climbing is more than just getting up any way you can. Rock climbing its value derives from doing it in a natural way. So he contributed this ethical core, this sense that even though you're using these aids, beyond that is an ideal. Paul Preuss's reputation played a role in him free soloing the climb on which he died, because it was the end of the season. He'd been trying to do this big project in the Mont Blanc range, the PEUTEREY ridge, and he was years behind the actual ability to complete the project, but he worked really hard at it. He came back, he was a professional speaker. He made a living a good living giving talks about his climbing, and he had to squeeze one last climb in. He felt both a professional pressure and a need to have new things to talk to people about. And you know, I think it says rather a lot that when he died, they found his appointment book for giving these talks in his back pocket. It's very difficult to assess the vector of Paul Preuss's career should he have survived the First World War and gone on into the interwar climbing scene where, you know, Emilio Comici uses 160 pitons, an unprecedented number. Not very many by standards of Yosemite in the 1960s, but a lot in the Eastern Alps to climb the north face of the CIMA Grande. And everyone's view of what was worth dying for changed after the war. People's views of the Eastern Alps in which Paul Preuss died changed enormously because the war was fought there. There was a lot of broken equipment and fortifications left all over the place. Valleys had been gassed, forests had been cut down, tens of thousands of men had lost their lives in the fighting. Mountaintops had been blown to bits. So the whole discourse about whether some pitons were going to destroy the Alps kind of seemed irrelevant. Paul Preuss started out saying everybody should climb in this way. Then he moved on to saying, by 1913 when he died, I represent the ideal. Others can use these things. I don't. I've explained why I don't. And people should see that there's other stuff beyond their conception of using this equipment. The book is available to buy in bookshops or online from RockyMountainBooks.com.